Hello, everybody, and welcome back to part two of our inflation podcast. Uh, Last time, remember, we talked about the difference between actual prices and inflation. Inflation is the rate at which prices are changing over time, and actual prices are what you pay for something if you go to get it right now. And of course, when there's an extended period of high inflation, you end up with much higher prices. And through the pandemic, we had a few years where we had some very high inflation. And although the inflation rate is now lower, it's back down to the 2 or 3% a year that it normally is. Um, the result of those few years of high inflation are that prices are really a lot higher for most things that people buy today than they were, say, 4 or 5 years ago, pre-pandemic. Um, but inflation is certainly not a new thing. Really, there's been a lot of periods of pretty high inflation and a huge increase in prices of most things over the last 50 years or so. Beginning in the early 70s and early 1970s and continuing through now, we've had multiple periods of really high inflation. And that's resulted in prices for a lot of things now being way higher than they used to be. But as we mentioned in the last podcast, just because prices are higher doesn't necessarily mean people are doing worse. You've got to look at wages too and compare them with prices. So, for example, if prices for everything have doubled over the last 10 years, but my wages have also doubled over the last 10 years, then on a relative basis, I'm paying about the same for stuff as I was 10 years ago. And so my overall financial position hasn't really deteriorated. So, bottom line, if wage increase keeps up with price increase, then you're doing okay. If wage increase exceeds price increase, then you're doing really well. And if wage increase does not keep up with price increase, then you're getting poorer, even though your wages may be higher now than they used to be, because you're spending a higher percentage of your money on necessities, and you have less fun money to spend on things you might prefer to do, like take vacations or buy some fun stuff or um, uh, go out to dinners or movies or whatever. So I think I made the case, and you can see it on this document I have here, which I showed you last time. I just added one thing to the document, and that's the average price of a gallon of milk, whole milk, which back in 1980 was $1.12 a gallon, and now is about $4.34. So that's an increase of about fourfold for just a gallon of milk since 1980. Now, again, is that bad or good? Well, it depends on whether your wages have kept up. And you can see the very first thing I put up here is the wage increase. Oops. Sorry. Forgot to do something important here. I forgot the proper setting for this. My bad. Let's see if I can activate it now. I don't think I can. Maybe I can. Oh, okay. So that's better. All right. So our wages in the 43 years since 1980 have only gone up on average about 2.5 times. But you can see the price we pay for lots of things that we like to spend money on has gone up much more than that. The average price of a new car is over the same time period is 6 times higher than it was, but our wages have only gone up 2.5 times. So we now have to spend much more of our wage if we want to buy a new car, like a whole year's worth of wage, average wage, if we want to buy a new car now. Whereas back in 1980, we only had to spend 4 months of our wage to get a new car. The rentals for a two-bedroom apartment have gone up 5.5 times over this period. Median home price has gone up 8.5 times over this period. All of these are way higher than our income has gone up. So although our income is higher now than it was in 1980 on average, everything else has gone up a lot more than our income. So we are relatively poorer now than we were in 1980. The average household was richer in 1980. That is, was spending less of its money on necessities like rent and cars and gas, and more of its money had more money to use for more fun stuff. So this has put people, particularly young people today, in a bind. Young people who are just starting out their careers now haven't had a chance to build wealth unless they, came from money. This is really putting them in a bind because stuff is so expensive now relative to incomes that young people really can't make ends meet without either borrowing a lot of money from family or from the government or from banks, and that puts them in a big hole right away as they start out their adult lives and careers, and that's just a terrible financial place to be in. It can take you decades to dig out of that. So it's why I get tired of when I hear people my age in the baby boom generation put down younger folks like millennials and even younger when they complain about their lives. They have a right to complain about their lives. Their lives economically are much harder than our lives were at their age. We had much better earning potential relative and much lower expenses when we were their age than they do. And they have no realistic way to make ends meet unless they're just come from wealth. They have no realistic way to make ends meet without borrowing heavily. And that's just a bad situation to be in. So this brings me to the important question here, which is why? Why, for the last 50 years or so, has inflation outstripped earnings? Earnings just have not kept up with inflation. So why? And you can ask that from both ends. Most people ask it from the inflation side. It's like, why has inflation been so high over the last 50 years? And we'll get into that. But really, I think the most important question is, why haven't wages kept up? Okay, yeah, we're spending a lot more for lots of stuff now, but why haven't our wages gone up to sort of match that? Because by all measures, workers today are pretty productive compared to workers 50 years ago. That is, when we say productive, it's got an economic meaning. It means how much good or service can you put out for a day's worth of work. And because of electronic innovations and mechanical innovations and a number of other reasons, workers today are more productive. You can get more stuff out of a worker now than you could 50 years ago, and yet workers aren't paid as well relative to the cost of things today as they were 50 years ago. So how come? So I'm going to look at that from both ends, the inflation end and the wages end. Why haven't wages gone up as much as they should have, and why has inflation been so high? We can start at either end, but I think I want to start with inflation. So, because that's the one people tend to focus on. Why have prices gone up so much in the last 50 years? Why are all these things so much more expensive? And some of this is down to natural resources. There are a lot more people in the world now than there were 50 years ago. And there's so many people that it's kind of straining the natural resources of our planet. Every person requires stuff, requires materials for the things they use or for the homes they live in, requires energy to run their devices, heat their homes, move their cars. And those materials and that energy, they have a cost to them. That's why homes aren't free and stuff isn't free. and energy isn't free. But nowadays, the cost of those things is higher because there are more people demanding more resources, and for some of the resources that we use routinely, we're running low globally on these resources. We don't have quite as much as we did 50 years ago of these things. There's more people demanding them, and they're harder to get to. You know, when you start off with things like energy and natural resources, mostly this is stuff to make these things, you need to dig stuff out of the ground. You need to dig out minerals, you need to dig out fossil fuels. And we started out by digging out the easy stuff, the stuff that was near the surface that we knew about. And, you know, so it didn't cost very much to extract it. But nowadays, for a lot of the things we use, including the energy materials, we've dug out the easy stuff already. We've used it up. And so now we got to dig deeper to get energy reserves, to get minerals for the stuff we make. We have to dig deeper. And it costs more to dig deeper. You know, and also for some things that we're running out of, we have to actively search for new underground reserves of this stuff. And, you know, they can be hard to find. So between the searching and the exploring and the digging deeper, it's costing companies that do this stuff more to get stuff out. And so naturally they charge more for it. And so some of this is just a pure resource increased human population issue. Fewer resources divided among more humans. And so the resources cost more. It's a supply and demand thing. Now, there have been some other changes, economic changes, and some psychological changes too, which have contributed to inflation. One of the things is like back in the 1960s, preventing companies from becoming monopolies, where one company just completely dominates a field, was a big deal. And the government was very active at preventing monopolization of goods and services. But starting with the 1970s and really accelerating under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, monopolies became okay. The government became much more okay allowing monopolies, allowing them to continue. And of course, when companies pretty much corner a market, they realize pretty quickly that if they're offering something that people really want, they can charge whatever they want for it because people don't really have an alternative. And so there's a lot of monopolies now in manufacturing and distribution, and even in discovery of new stuff. They're much more common now than they were in the 60s, and so that's giving pricing power, what's called pricing power, the ability to raise prices without hurting their bottom line too much, to these companies that form functional monopolies. In most fields now that provide, lots of people with things they need, there's actually not much competition. There's a few different companies, maybe 2, 3, 4, and that's pretty much it. And they don't compete as much as they just sort of mimic each other. So if like one company raises prices, the other two raise their prices. So that's also contributing to inflation. As companies they raise their prices because they can. Another thing I should probably put in here is corporations now prioritize their stock value over, say, employee or customer satisfaction. That's a bit of a cultural change from when I was younger. Back in the 60s, corporations, they realized they were getting some breaks from the government, and they felt like they should give back some. and that they should value their customer satisfaction, they should value their employees, you know, and so they made those things more of a priority. And of course, one way you can prioritize customer satisfaction is by giving good value for not too much money. Um, but these days, starting with the 1980s, although a little bit in the 70s, companies started focusing much more on their stock value. They switched to, the people we really need to take care of are our employees and our customers. They switched from that to the people we really need to take care of are our stockholders who are investing in us. And there was a lot of reason for that, but the main one being that, when your stock is popular, if you're a corporate board and corporate, leaders, if your stock is popular and your shares are going up, then the people at the top make a lot of money. Because people at the top often have stock options and are very, invested in the stock end of the company. So, and that doesn't necessarily translate when your employees and customers are happy. Generally, when your employers and customers are happy, it's because you're paying well and giving good value, but that narrows your profit margin and doesn't make your stockholders as happy. And so once that switch occurred to the stockholders are happy when you're basically ripping off customers and cutting employees because that increases the profitability of the company. And so once that switchover occurred where the stock value became more important, and that really began in earnest and again in the 1980s, then corporations didn't feel like they had to give value to customers, and they started cheaping out on components and also overcharging for things and cutting employees. We'll get to the cutting employees thing also in the next part. Another thing that's really kept inflation up, and this has been a weird one, is a change in psychology of the consumer, the average American buyer of stuff. We used to buy the things we needed or the things we really, really wanted. Now we buy stuff for the sake of buying stuff because it makes us feel a little better and relieves our stress. And that explains this phenomenon where even when the economy is bad, like it was early in COVID, people just keep buying stuff. Now, on the one hand, stock folks love this addiction because it means that, even if people aren't feeling very good about their economic well-being, they're still going to buy products, and so these companies are still going to make money. But really, a lot of the buying we're doing now is for psychological and stress reduction reasons, we're not getting things we really need. We're just getting things that when we buy them give us a little hit of dopamine and adrenaline and make us feel a little better because we're miserable. Because ultimately buying stuff doesn't really satisfy the deep needs of life. But it can give you a quick hit of dopamine, and sort of an addiction, like a drug addiction. Also, the same thing can be applied to the way we eat now. People do a lot of stress eating these days, and that in part explains why a lot of us are overweight. We stress eat, we eat to make ourselves feel better emotionally. We don't just eat when we're hungry. We eat when we're emotionally unsatisfied. And also, of course, we don't move around as much as we used to. So combination there is making us heavy. And this buying addiction is similar. But it does sort of guarantee companies will continue to make money even in relatively bad economic times. And that means they have little incentive to lower prices because they know that people now need to buy their stuff, not because they need their stuff, but just because they need the act of buying to make themselves feel better. So that's a weird little psychological quirk that we've developed in our culture. But anyway, all of these things contribute to inflation, and I'm sure there's other things that I've left off the list you could probably think of yourself. But I want to actually really focus on the other end of this. I want to focus on the wages, because to me it's less disturbing that prices are going up than it is that prices are going up and wages aren't.